As Scotland entered the 15th century, it proudly stood a free and independent nation. With its king at its head and the wonders of the landscape around it, there was surely cause for optimism. But there was also cause for concern. The Highland clans had never really been subdued, and their resistance to the increasing Anglicisation of the south resulted not only from the mountains. For the Highlanders were no mere heathens. They had developed their own sophisticated culture that made it difficult for the king to assert his authority.
The Highland and Lowland divide was a cultural thing. It was more of a leaning to the Irish side. Up to the time, say, of the lordship of the Isles, these families were working in unity, although they were clans and living separate areas. They would come together collectively. They had a parliament, democratic union of understanding, of trading, of marriages, of land gifts, and etc. And this society lived quite well till about the year 1493, when it fell apart and the lordship of the Isles broke up. During the period of the lordship, they were encouraging education, and there was trades like stonemasons and harpers were considered a trade. There were physicians, there was pipers. Well, pipers were coming on a bit later, certainly. But basically, there was people who were judges and people who were responsible for weights and balance. And it was quite a sophisticated culture. And it was a Gaelic culture, whereas from below the Great Glen, you're into lowlands, basically, where it's a different culture altogether and much more leaning towards north of England as opposed to the south of England. But that was the clash of culture. I think at the time the Highland clans were hoping to annex the Highlands away from the lower part of Scotland and let them get on with being Scotland and let the Highlands remain Gaelic.
Apart from the Highlands, the authorities also faced a power struggle between the barons of the south. The burden of resolving these problems was about to pass to one family in particular, the Stewarts. The main centre of what became known as the Stewartry is Kirkcudbright in the Dumfries and Galloway region. The origins of the Stewartry go back to 1296, when, as we saw in part 1, King John Balliol was forced to renounce his crown to Edward I. Following this, lands were confiscated from the Balliols and placed under the administration of the FitzAlan family, who had come with William the Conqueror and held the hereditary position of High Stewards to the king. The FitzAlans thus became the stewards of these lands. When Robert the Bruce's daughter Marjorie married into this family, the foundations were laid for the royal dynasty that became known as the Stewarts. For the marriage meant that when in 1371 the Bruce family failed to produce a male heir, the crown would pass to them. Today, Kirkcudbright has a reputation as being one of the most attractive of the Solway towns. With its colourful waterfront and the remains of the 16th century MacLellan's castle overlooking the harbour, it's not surprising that a colony of artists was drawn here in the late 19th century. The toll booth, built around 1610, commemorates John Paul Jones, who was imprisoned here for the manslaughter of his ship's carpenter, who had died after a flogging. He was later freed, and he went on to take the credit for laying the foundations of the American Navy. But the first of the Stuart kings, Robert II, was troubled not by naval battles, but his own dissident barons and clans. Thrieve Castle symbolises the power of these ambitious men whose lands rivalled those of the king. For this was a stronghold of one such clan, the Black Douglases. Their ruthlessness is summed up by the gallows knob over the castle door, from which the Douglases hanged their enemies. Their influence persisted well beyond Robert's lifetime, and indeed his son, Robert III, trusted them so little that he sent his own heir, James, to France for safety. The boy was captured by the English, and after Robert's death, families like the Douglases exploited the power vacuum. When Robert's son returned to his throne as James I in 1424, he tried to restore order through a series of executions and annexations of earldoms. His son, James II, succeeded at the age of 6, setting a Stuart pattern of child monarchs. The paralysis of power that this created meant that it was not until 1455 that Threave Castle became the last Douglas stronghold to surrender to the king, and only then after the walls were battered by cannon. The mighty Mons Meg cannon is now in Edinburgh, and its awesome proportions are a vivid reminder of what was needed to overcome such a powerful family. But the turmoil did not end with the fall of the Black Douglases, for James II was himself killed by exploding cannon at the siege of Roxburgh. In the corridors of the baronial castles, his death signalled a continuation of the plotting and feuding, since it created a vacuum in power as the throne once again passed to a child monarch. When, after 10 years of rule by regents, James III finally took the reins of power, he married Margaret of Denmark. As surety for her dowry, Orkney and Shetland were handed over to Scotland, and the kingdom was complete. But the king continued to antagonize the nobles, and 20 years later was ousted in a coup led by his son, James IV. Ladykirk, close to the mouth of the Tweed, comprises a mere handful of houses, but amidst them sits the graceful church that James IV built in honour of a vow. It was erected as a shrine in gratitude after he had almost been killed crossing the Tweed. Churches and palaces thrived during his reign, and this flamboyant, pious and sensual king was a typical monarch of the Renaissance. Under his rule, Scotland enjoyed a golden age. He was a man of conciliation rather than confrontation, who much desired a united Europe. To this end, he married Margaret Tudor, the 12-year-old daughter of Henry VII, and signed a treaty of perpetual peace with England. But a storm was brewing. It would reverberate across the land, and one of Scotland's wisest kings was destined to be consumed by one of its greatest tragedies. France was being threatened from all sides, including England, and in order to maintain a balance of power and mediate, he renewed the old alliance with France. Against the advice of his lords, he rode out of his palace and returned here to Ladykirk for what was to be the last time. Here, in the quiet of the church, he paused for a final prayer. The English king had spurned his efforts to mediate, and persuaded by the French and under obligation to honour the old alliance, James IV was about to lead his army into battle against the English. Here, on the eve of the battle, he begged God for victory. The prayer was not answered. The Battle of Flodden Field was a massacre that claimed the flower of Scotland's youth. With them fell their king, and so great was the impact that Scotland would perhaps never be quite the same again. Among the places where the tragedy is commemorated is Selkirk. Now a market town, Selkirk was initially known for its shoemakers or suitors. Indeed, people from the town are still referred to as suitors, and Bonnie Prince Charlie ordered 4,000 pairs of shoes from here for his barefooted army in 1745. The town has long owed much of its prosperity to its location on the southern flank of the Ettrick Water Valley. Its development accelerated in the 17th century following the introduction of weaving. And with the industrialization of the 19th century, tweed mills were established along the valley floor. In front of the town hall, Sir Walter Scott's statue looms down from its pedestal to remind us that he was sheriff here for 33 years. The statue marks the site of the original courtroom in the old toll booth. But it's another memorial that recalls the tragedy of Flodden Field. Of the 80 Selkirk men who fought at Flodden in 1513, only one returned. This lone survivor threw down a captured English standard at the feet of the families that stood in Selkirk, waiting for their dead sons to return. Tragic landmark though it was, Flodden was by no means the end of the struggles with the English. Of all the border towns, it was Jedburgh that took the worst hammerings in the wars with England. A gateway town located on a strategic route into Scotland, it was burned and gutted more frequently than anywhere else. Teenage youths, or callants, a word still widely used throughout the borders to describe young boys, would miss no opportunity to ride out in order to protect the borough boundaries. Such ridings were common all over this part of Scotland. The Jedburgh Callant reenacts these common ridings of the past. One of the many reenactments held in border towns is held annually, commencing on the last Saturday in June and culminating on the following Friday. Common ridings of today, with their programme of festivities, are a source of colour and pageantry for visitors. But they also provide an opportunity for the people of the borders to remember the dead of 2 world wars. The Jedburgh Callant is a vivid reminder of the unrest which continued right through the reign of James V. But even after the death of James, Scotland's troubles were far from over. James V's daughter was only a few days old when her father died. She grew up to become Mary Queen of Scots. Sensual and naive, even as a child, she was unavoidably placed at the centre of political events.
She was sent to France when she was 5 years old because prior to that, Henry VIII had been trying to kidnap this little girl as he wanted his young son Edward to marry her and then he could control Scotland. So he had tried to kidnap her. This was called the rough wooing. So her mother, Mary de Guise, decided the best place for her daughter was France. She sent her there when she was 5 years old with her 4 little Marys. And she was brought up in the court of France by her de Guise uncles, 3 powerful French noblemen. And she was a willful little girl. She was very spoiled and the darling of the court of France.
While Mary was growing up in Catholic France, the old intellectual order in Scotland was starting to change.
There was a powerful intellectual movement of ideas which led to social change, because the older aristocratic and hereditary order was now being challenged by a new sense of what society was about and what the proper role of the educated lay middle classes was to be in it.
At the heart of the changes taking place was a man whose influence was as forceful as the intimidating Victorian sepulchres amidst which his statue now stands. In 1451, the Pope decreed that it was as meritorious to make a pilgrimage to Glasgow Cathedral as to Rome. The man whose statue rises up out of the cathedral's western necropolis would have found little to venerate in Rome. For John Knox's avowed aim was to drive Catholicism out of Scotland completely. Initially, however, it was he who was driven out and forced into exile for his support of the early Protestant reform movements.
Even among the Protestant reformers in Europe, Knox stood out for his radical views. If the monarch was unjust, the king or queen should be deposed. And when Knox came back to Scotland from exile, and Mary Queen of Scots returned a year and a half later here to Edinburgh to become queen, a major clash was inevitable.
Now, she believed that everyone should worship as they wanted to, and as long as they let her worship as a Roman Catholic, which she did, but she didn't do it discreetly. She made a parade of her priests, which did not please John Knox. And also her behaviour, which to her was normal, as the court of France had taught her, to the Scottish people was immoral, amoral, and this did not help her one bit.
The independence of the church from the state became a key issue, and it may well have been here at John Knox's house in Edinburgh where Mary and Knox met to discuss their differences.
4 famous interviews took place between Knox and Mary, and it's in such a room as we're in now that these interviews would have taken place, with this panelling around us that was originally created by Mary's royal goldsmith, James Mossman. But the struggle was not really resolved.
She was a good queen in the fact that she did love her people, but she didn't understand them. And that was her problem. Also, she had the problem of language. Her natural language by then was French. The Scottish people spoke 2 languages. The Highlanders spoke what we call the Gaelic. The Lowlanders spoke what was then called Lowlands, which we now call the Doric. Now, that's difficult enough for English-speaking people to understand, and for Mary it was quite impossible. So poor girl, half the time she didn't understand what was going on in her council meetings, which made life very difficult for her.
Mary's political naivety and cultural isolation was in stark contrast to the English queen, Elizabeth I.
Her cousin Elizabeth, on the other hand, she was a born survivor, politically brilliant, way ahead of her time. I mean, the Maggie Thatcher of her time, and clever enough to surround herself with brains, pick these brains, but Elizabeth always made the final decision. Whereas poor Mary, if someone said, well, this is what we think you should do, she would do it.
Such malleability was bound to prove disastrous, given the complex political relationship that existed between Scotland and its closest neighbours.
If the Scots allied themselves with the French against the English, which they often felt they had to for their own security, they inevitably appeared as a major security threat to the English, a threat from the rear, if you like, as the English conducted their big continental wars.
Well, Queen Elizabeth, one thing she could not have was to allow Queen Mary to have a strong husband, as that would have been an added threat to the English throne. So, being devious, she had a plan. She wrote to Mary saying, I think it is time you now married, and I will send you the jewel of my crown, who was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, who was Queen Elizabeth's lover. Mary was very angry about the whole thing, so she wrote back saying, no, thank you, I do not want your discarded lover, especially your horsemaster, which he was. So on the heels of that, Queen Elizabeth sent up this handsome young man, aged 19, Lord Darnley, who was a Scotsman and was a Stewart. And he was well versed in all the arts, music, dancing, poetry, everything that Mary Queen of Scots liked. So she fell in love with this handsome boy and wrote to Queen Elizabeth saying, I am going to marry Lord Darnley. Elizabeth wrote back saying, I forbid it. Knowing what would happen, Mary immediately married Lord Darnley. And Queen Elizabeth was delighted because she knew that he had every vice under the sun and would bring Mary down, which he did. A couple of weeks after the wedding, Mary found him in bed with her pages.
Elizabeth I's success in tricking Mary into an unhappy marriage to the homosexual Darnley triggered a series of events that culminated here at Dunbar. It was to the now ruined castle at this ancient fishing port that the Earl of Bothwell brought Mary in 1567. They were shortly to be married. The events leading up to the marriage were as dramatic as those that would follow it.
Bothwell, he was James Hebburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a Scottish nobleman who had supported Mary's mother, Mary de Guise, while she was Regent of Scotland. He had become very friendly with Mary de Guise and been a staunch supporter through all the battles she had. So when Mary became a widow and was asked to leave France, Lord Bothwell got himself into the welcoming party of Scottish nobles and told Mary that he was a friend of her mother's, therefore she immediately formed an attachment. And when they came back to Scotland, she had begun to lean on Bothwell. Now, Bothwell was a very virile, macho man who was very attractive to the ladies. Mary had been married, first of all, to a sickly child, and her second husband, a practicing homosexual. So she herself was a very sensual, healthy lady and was physically attracted to Bothwell. So their liaison did start fairly soon and continued over the years. Eventually, the Scottish lords began to fear Bothwell because of the influence he was having over Mary. Also during these years, she had formed an attachment for her Italian secretary, Rizzio, who had come to the court in Holyrood as an impoverished musician. She had liked him, therefore she gave him riches and made him her secretary. He used to work with her during the night in her bedroom. So the Scottish nobles decided it was time Rizzio was got rid of. So they told her husband, Darnley, that Rizzio was having too much influence over Mary, was stopping Darnley from gaining the crown matrimonial, which he wanted.
It was at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh that Darnley moved into action. Supported by a band of nobles, he invaded Mary's supper room, dragged Rizzio out and stabbed him to death. At that time, Mary was pregnant, and while he was stabbing Rizzio, Darnley turned to Mary and said, "You know the child you're carrying is not mine." The suspicion, never proved, was that the child, the future James VI, was Rizzio's, which, if true, leads to the interesting possibility of Italian blood in the royal family. Whatever the case, Mary's extramarital association with Bothwell continued. This house in Jedburgh was one of the places she would stay when presiding over the assizes. It also afforded the opportunity to meet with Bothwell. On one occasion, she became ill after meeting her lover and almost died here.
She had a French doctor. Now, whether or not he panicked, we don't know, but he started shaking the body. The combination of the fresh air and the shaking revived her. She eventually recovered to go back to Holyrood Palace, but shortly afterwards, Darnley was murdered. Now, Bothwell was accused of the murder, but acquitted, but he's a very devious chap. The day of the trial, he flooded Edinburgh with all his wild border reivers, and they knew if he was convicted, there'd be a bloodbath.
As a result, Bothwell was allowed to go free. With Darnley gone, Mary was now able to marry her lover. It was political suicide. By marrying a Protestant, she alienated not only the followers of John Knox, but the Catholics too. Mary was taken to Lochleven Castle, where her reign over Scotland was brought to a humiliating end. For this once proud queen had so antagonized her people that she was forced to abdicate in favor of her son James. For almost a year, Mary remained imprisoned on this island stronghold at Lochleven. When she finally managed to escape, her supporters were defeated at the Battle of Langside, and there began a remarkable 14-day flight across the Galloway countryside. It was here, at Dundrennan Abbey, that the Scottish stage of Mary Queen of Scots' flight came to an end. Surrounded by these walls and framed by these arches, she held her last council in Scotland on Sunday, the 16th of May, 1568. It's not known whether, grateful for the care offered by the abbot and his monks, she slept here or merely rested, but it's certain that somewhere in these ruins she sat and wrote her final pleading letter to her cousin, Queen Elizabeth of England. Even now, although the abbey can only hint at its former splendor, it's easy to imagine the ghostly image of Mary Queen of Scots, dressed in her tattered clothes, her head shorn for disguise, reconciled to the fact that her best hope of survival was not France, but sanctuary in England. On the Sunday afternoon, her tall, slender figure made its way out of the abbey to the quay used by the monks in what are now the idyllic surroundings of Abbeyburn-Foot. From here, Mary embarked on a fishing boat for the English coast. As she bade her farewell to Scotland for the last time, she was still unaware of the gruesome fate that awaited her. For it was not sanctuary that was forthcoming from Queen Elizabeth, but imprisonment. The politically naive Mary rode straight into the hands of her devious cousin. She remained in England for almost 20 years, until Elizabeth ordered her to be beheaded. Her fate had finally been sealed. Mary's son, James VI, made only a token protest, knowing that when Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, died heirless, the throne of England would be his. He gained his prize on the 27th of March, 1603, and then hurried to London, setting foot in Scotland only once more in his life. James VI of Scotland was now also James I of England. In the years that followed, Scotland remained an independent nation. But with the union of the crowns, power and influence were slipping away. Its destiny was becoming increasingly tied to that of its southern neighbour. However, the political clash between the church and the state that had manifested itself in the teachings of John Knox had opened up a chasm that was to run through the next 3 centuries of Scottish history.
It went on to the great prayer book controversy when Jenny Geddes is supposed to have flung her stool at the minister in St Giles when he first tried to read from King Charles I's new prayer book. It led to the civil wars, to Cromwell's occupation of Scotland, and then on to social conflict in the 18th century and to the Great Disruption in 1843 when the Church of Scotland was split down the middle by the same issue, the independence of the church from the state. So that continued to be a political hot potato, tied up with Scottish independence, the right of self-determination, and so on.
A noble phase in this continuing struggle was brought into focus here at Greyfriars Church in Edinburgh. In 1625, James VI was succeeded by his son, Charles I. It was as a consequence of his actions that in 1638, thousands flocked to this churchyard to place the first signatures on the National Covenant. Having been brought up in England, Charles knew nothing of Scotland. Therefore, when he tried to harmonise the form of church service between the two countries, he had no idea of the reaction this would produce. The violent opposition and the signing of the Covenant resulted partly from national feeling against a distant king, but mainly from Protestant fervour.
The Covenanters were a reaction. The religious freedoms and the new Protestant church that had been won by Knox was then overthrown by the British monarchy. And the reaction to that was the Covenanters, a return to the primitive first principles of the Protestant faith as espoused by Knox.
The Covenant was a document that condemned all Catholic practices and undertook to uphold the true religion. Many copies were made and they were carried all over the Scottish lowlands and signed amid strong national feeling. Although it was the introduction of the Scottish prayer book by Charles I that brought the issue to the boil, it had been simmering ever since James VI had tried to bring the mainly Protestant Scotland into line with England by re-establishing the bishops. The newly appointed bishops did not have an easy time in Scotland, and it was not unknown for them to be assaulted while reading from the new prayer book. Later in the year that the Covenant was signed, a Covenanter-packed General Assembly of the Church of Scotland at Glasgow abolished episcopacy, in spite of the fact that this body had itself already been abolished. When the Civil War broke out in England, the Scottish Covenanters backed Parliament and the Roundhead forces of Oliver Cromwell. The alliance became known as the Solemn League and Covenant. It was hoped that a victorious Parliament would make Presbyterianism compulsory in England and Ireland, as well as Scotland. When Charles I was executed in 1649 and Parliament had won the day, the Covenanters believed that their strategy had paid off. Their next objective was to achieve stability following the king's execution. His 18-year-old son gave an undertaking not to oppose Presbyterianism and to accept the Covenant. As a result, the Covenanters invited him to Scotland and proclaimed him King Charles II. But the plan backfired. For having defeated the monarchy in England, Cromwell was in no mood to see it perpetuated in Scotland. He had no hesitation in marching north and defeating the Covenanters' army at Dunbar. With the Restoration in 1660, the Covenanters doubtlessly had reason to think that, in view of his previous undertaking, the reinstated Charles II really would have his nose to the grindstone on their behalf. But such a notion was filled with irony, for once in power, Charles's concern for Scotland's religious aspirations magically disappeared, and he actually removed much of the Presbyterian Church's power. The Covenanters were forced to retreat into their cottages and kitchens, for persecution and suffering awaited anyone brave or foolish enough to publicly demonstrate their allegiance to the Covenant. Scotland was entering a period that became known as the Killing Times. But the Covenanters remained true to their cause, frequently fleeing to the hills and worshipping in secret gatherings known as conventicles. However, they did not meekly submit to oppression, but their attempts to rise up against their persecutors, such as that made at Bothwell Brig, proved futile. 400 Covenanters were slaughtered at Bothwell Brig. For the 1,200 who survived and were captured, the price they paid was 5 months' imprisonment at Greyfriars in Edinburgh. Wigton is the main centre for the Machars Peninsula. The town's spacious market square is evidence of its long association with cattle trading and features a railed enclosure that was once used to pen in cattle for the night. For in years gone by, Wigton was a principal target for the notorious border rustlers. But this quiet little place also reveals how the persecution of the Covenanters continued well after the Battle of Bothwell Brig. Beside the parish church are the ruins of two former churches, which provide a humble setting for all that remains to remind us of a tragic injustice. For amidst the ruins are the graves of 8 Covenanters, 2 of whom became known as the Wigton Martyrs. In 1685, Margaret MacLachlan, 62 years old and guilty of nothing but her faith, was sentenced to a cruel fate. Beside her stood Margaret Wilson. Just 18 years old, her life had barely begun. Here at Wigton, these 2 women were convicted of having attended 20 illegal prayer meetings. What followed was one of the cruelest moments in the history of this community. At low tide, an excited crowd gathered on the bleak salt marshes outside the town as the 2 Margarets were taken out and tied to separate posts. As the tide began to rise, inch by inch and second by second, Margaret MacLachlan was slowly consumed by the waters. The post to which her companion was tied had been placed so that she could witness the agony of the older woman's death throes. She was given the chance to repent, but refused. And so, after seeing her companion die, she too drowned in the rising waters. Today, a simple pillar marks the site of the barbaric execution of the Wigton Martyrs. The passing of the killing times sadly did not mean an end to the killing. Just as the Protestants had been prepared to die for their beliefs, so too were the Catholics in the years that followed. This turn of events was triggered when Charles II died and the throne passed to his brother, James VII. The accession of this Stuart king presented the prospect of a continuing line of openly Catholic monarchs.
He, unfortunately for some people, tended to have strong Catholic tendencies. And he began to impose these tendencies on the populace of Britain. Now, in England, of course, which was mainly a Protestant country, these impositions of his did not go down at all well with the majority of the people. And eventually, a strong group of English landlords got together and they forced James to abdicate, and he fled to the continent, to France. In this place, this strong group of English Protestants invited across from Holland William of Orange and his wife. Now, his wife, in fact, was James's daughter. So, although she was a Protestant and William was a very strong Protestant, so they decided to come over and took over the throne of England. However, in the north of England, and in Scotland in particular, this left a large body of Jacobites, as they later became known, who had been used to the Scottish Stuart kings for hundreds of years and to their strong traditions.
Faced with this situation, the Jacobites determined to restore James VII to the throne, but they needed an experienced leader.
They persuaded John Graham of Claverhouse, who was a very prominent general in the British Army, to recruit a Jacobite army and fight for the Jacobite cause. Now, he knew that the strength of the Jacobites lay in the highlands of Scotland amongst the clan chiefs. So he and a picked small band of officers loyal to the Jacobite cause came up to the Highlands of Scotland here, and they began to go round the clan chiefs.
Graham of Claverhouse persuaded the clan chiefs to let him have about 2,500 fighting Highlanders. They were rough and ready troops, but nevertheless fearless in battle, and particularly renowned for their practice of charging at the enemy. With Claverhouse at its head, the Highland army marched south. Surrounded by magnificent Highland scenery, the small town of Blair Athol stands at the meeting point of several glens. Therefore, in the past, this area was of great strategic importance. Indeed, it commanded the gateway to the Central Highlands. Even today, Blair Athol is the last place of any size on the Great North Road. However, the town was only removed to its current location in the 18th century. Before that, it was situated a short distance away, close to the castle that had long exploited the strategic significance of the area. And it was to Blair Castle that Claverhouse led his army. It was the perfect stronghold. But in the event, the seizure of the castle in 1689 by the Jacobites turned out to be the prelude to a savage battle, the Battle of Killiecrankie.
The British government, meaning the English government, shall we call them, they were very concerned about what was happening up in the Highlands of Scotland. So they hurriedly raised an army to send north to suppress this rebellion. And in charge of this army, they appointed General Hugh Mackay, another Scotsman who in fact had been a buddy of John Graham of Claverhouse in their British Army days. And he, at the head of 4,000 fairly raw troops, but nevertheless well equipped, well uniformed, well fed, they came marching north. And on the evening of the 26th of July 1689, they had reached Dunkeld. Early the next morning, on the 27th of July, they set out with their 1,000 pack horses, 4,500 redcoats, heavy uniforms, lots of ammunition, each man with a Brown Bess musket, and they marched. And they must have been very fit men because they reached Killiecrankie by midday, having marched the 15 miles from Dunkeld. Now, the pass of Killiecrankie at that time was the only communication between the south of Scotland and the north. So all traffic moving to the north had to come through the pass. And General Hugh Mackay was worried about this because with only width for 2 men to march at a time, his forces would be straggled out for a mile or even 2 miles, and of course 1,000 horses as well could only come through one at a time.
Despite his concerns, Mackay steered his army through the pass and formed them into line of battle a mile to the north. Hearing of this, Claverhouse led his men out from Blair Castle and lined them up facing down the slopes towards the government redcoats.
Now, John Graham of Claverhouse, Bonnie Dundee, as he became romantically known later on, he knew that his men had to see what they were charging at, and he waited, therefore, until the sun had gone round behind the hill and the evening came down. And there the two armies waited until 7 o'clock, when suddenly Bonnie Dundee gave the order to charge, and the 2,500 Highlanders came sweeping down the hill. They covered these few hundred yards in a matter of a half-minute or so. Meanwhile, the redcoats fired their first volley, and you can imagine what the sound was of 3,000 muskets going off at one time. Now, this volley killed, in a fraction of a second, it killed about 800 of the charging Highlanders. But the rest of them, before the redcoats could reload their cumbersome muskets, the rest of them were in amongst the redcoats with their broadswords, their targes, their huge claymores, and their pistols. And in order to charge more effectively, the practice at that time was for the Highlanders to discard their plaids or their kilt, as it's become known now, and to charge just simply in their shirt tails, so that they were perfectly free to use their swords and their dirks and claymores. And in a fraction of a second, in fact, the whole battle only lasted 15 minutes. And in that 15 minutes, over 3,000 men were killed.
Overwhelmed, the government troops turned tail and fled. And in the case of one young soldier, fear prompted an almost superhuman feat.
One of the redcoat soldiers who was fleeing from the battle came eventually to a narrow point in the river, and there he was being sorely pressed by the pursuing Highlanders, and there was only one thing he could do to save his life, and that was to leap the river. He took a run at the river and he jumped the 18 feet across, and so saved his life. And ever since then, right up to this day, the place where he jumped is known as the Soldier's Leap. His name was Donald McBean. He was a regular soldier in the British Army, and 30 years later, after he'd retired from military life, he wrote about this episode in his younger fighting days, and so we know that in fact it was a true event just following the battle.
As the government troops fled across this beautiful countryside surrounding Killiecrankie, the leaders were no doubt reflecting on how, as on many occasions before, the unorthodox fighting methods of the Highlanders had succeeded in defeating superior forces. But the Jacobite celebrations were short-lived. Only 1 month later, the government troops secured victory over them at Dunkeld. Claverhouse was mortally wounded and his army left leaderless. However, the Jacobite cause lived on, and William of Orange was more determined than ever to assert his authority. It was the consequences of this determination that led to yet another massacre. Stretching from the desolation of Rannochmoor down to the shores of Loch Leven, Glencoe is regarded by many as Scotland's finest glen. The sheer natural beauty of this dramatic pass is hard to better. It's amidst this highland landscape that an event took place that has given Glencoe another name, the Weeping Glen. To assert his authority in 1692, King William demanded that every clan swear an oath of loyalty to him. For the MacDonalds of Glencoe, this was the prelude to a disaster.
The clansmen were given until New Year's Eve to sign this allegiance to the king. And because of the weather, MacDonald of Glencoe was late in doing this, about 24 hours, and had been sent all the way down to Argyll and in driving snow, but was late, but had actually signed on the dotted line.
Even so, missing the deadline gave the king the perfect opportunity to make an example of this troublesome clan. He ordered the MacDonalds' old enemies, the Campbells, to lodge with them in their home at Glencoe. At the beginning of February, Campbell of Glenlyon billeted himself and 128 soldiers with the MacDonalds. For 12 days they lived as guests, accepting the generous hospitality that was such an integral part of Highland life. But at dawn on the 13th day, they rose and repaid their hosts in the most cynical way. They slaughtered every MacDonald under the age of 70 while they slept. It's reputed that Glenlyon's piper played to warn them, but his efforts were in vain. 40 MacDonalds were killed outright, and many more subsequently perished of exposure. An official inquiry confirmed that, although the king had given orders, they were undoubtedly exceeded. even in the Highlands, where murder was common, murder under trust was unforgivable.
Well, this was a lesson to the Highlands to say that you must toe the line and you must live within the system. It also was an affront to Highland hospitality. For over the years, people could walk in any place and an open door, they would get a meal, and now all of a sudden you were bringing the enemy into your house. And this all started a whole turmoil of things happening in Scotland.
The Glencoe massacre, commemorated by this cross in Glencoe village, weakened but did not destroy the influence of the clans. But it did succeed in removing the Highland threat to the king's authority. When Queen Anne succeeded William in 1702, the Jacobite issue was still very much alive. A year earlier, following the death of Anne's only child, the English Parliament had passed the Act of Settlement. This specified that if Anne died childless, the crown would go to Sophia of Hanover, the Protestant grandchild of James I, and her descendants. By requiring that the monarch must belong to the Church of England, the Act automatically excluded a reversion to the exiled Stuart dynasty. While the English Parliament was busy keeping the Catholic Stuarts at bay, Scotland's Parliament had other matters to attend to. The Scots were verging on bankruptcy, thanks to an unsuccessful attempt to colonize the Darien coast on the Isthmus of Panama. Today, the building in Edinburgh that housed the Scottish Parliament at the start of the 18th century is the home of the Scottish Law Courts. It was handed over to the legal profession in 1707, following an agreement that was reached within these walls, the Act of Union with England. The English knew of the Scots' financial plight from the activities of Daniel Defoe in his role as a government spy. Therefore, they offered a deal. If Scotland would accept a Hanoverian monarch and agree to the Union of Parliaments, it would retain the right to Presbyterianism and be given much-needed trade concessions. Perhaps it was the latter that proved most persuasive, for many saw the Union as a sellout by the self-interested noblemen of the Scottish Parliament. Be that as it may, the politicians headed for London, leaving Edinburgh as a city with the architectural and cultural heritage of a legislature, but no law-making body. Even after the Union of Parliaments, the Jacobite issue simmered on. Many, especially in the Highlands, still believed that the true monarch was not a Hanoverian, but a Stuart. James Edward Stuart, the son of the deposed James VII, became known as the Old Pretender and was the focus for a series of uprisings, the first of which occurred in 1715. Not for the first time, the authorities pondered over what to do about the clans. At 4,406 feet, Ben Nevis is Britain's highest mountain. This snow-capped granite mass, ever popular with climbers and walkers, is in many ways a somewhat unprepossessing lump. Over 500 million years old, it looks down on what could be called the epitome of a West Highland town, Fort William. Fort William developed around a series of strategically sited strongholds and forts at the southern end of the Great Glen. The fort, after which the town was named, was demolished in the mid-19th century, but in the years following the Union, it was a key Jacobite target. The original earth construction proved quite inadequate to withstand the attacks mounted by rebellious Highlanders, but by the time the Jacobites struck in 1715, it had been rebuilt in stone. Fort William was originally named Maryborough after the wife of William III, but was later changed in honor of the king himself. In the years following the Union, it was a priority to protect strategic strongpoints like this, and one man's responsibility in particular.
Well, General Wade was appointed to be the army commander in Scotland. There always has been an army commander in Scotland since the Union of the Crowns anyway, and he was the King's appointment. And General Wade was really an engineer to trade, and he saw the opportunities of opening up the Highlands, and he built roads and bridges and the forts along the Great Glen, Fort George, Fort William and Fort Augustus. And he was responsible for really for opening up the Highlands so that the trains, when I say the trains, I mean the baggage trains, could get through to support the troops.
The network of military roads that was built by General Wade forms the basis of many of today's main routes through the Highlands. The current B852, which straddles Loch Ness on its way through the Great Glen, is one of the many examples. From earliest times, the Great Glen has formed a natural avenue. A geological fault, it slices through the mountains, dividing the central and northern Highlands. It was thanks to Wade's road building that many towns began to prosper, among them Pitlochry. Located in the middle of Scotland and cradled by hills, it's not surprising that this delightful area has become very popular with tourists. Pitlochry's attraction to visitors was given a boost when Queen Victoria, staying at Blair Athol, declared it to be one of the finest resorts in Europe. But it was General Wade who first prompted the town's expansion when he built the military road from Dunkeld to Inverness. Before his military building project, there were no roads north of Dunkeld, and Pitlochry was a small, inaccessible hamlet. But as well as promoting towns, Wade's program also spawned a regiment.
He persuaded the king that he needed some troops, some properly armed troops, to do this police work for him. And he was allowed to raise 6 independent companies in and around the Highlands to undertake the job of policing the Highlands. And he dressed them in a dark tartan so that they could be distinguished from the other troops, the scarlet of the other troops. And so they were known as the Black Watch, black for the dark tartan, watch for watching the Highlands. In about 1739, the king had decided that he wanted to form a Highland regiment. And the independent companies were brought together. And they came together in 1740 at Aberfeldy and became a regiment. And then some years later, in about 1743, the king decided that he wanted to review this regiment and asked them to go to London. And you must remember that these men were Gaelic speakers, they didn't understand English, and they had undertaken to serve the Crown to police the Highlands. They weren't expecting to be sent abroad. Well, anyway, in about 1744, 1745, they were sent to Flanders, and there they fought the Battle of Fontenoy. And while that was going on, of course, the Jacobite rebellion was at its height. And I have this theory, which I always put about, that had the Black Watch been doing its proper job of work in the Highlands, policing the Highlands, the Second Jacobite Rebellion may never have happened.
But it did happen. The son of the old pretender, the deposed James VII, whom the Jacobites regarded as the true king, chose his moment well. With the Black Watch out of the way, he sailed into Scotland from France, vowing to win back the crown for his father. They called him the Young Pretender. But Charles Edward Stuart would be remembered everywhere as Bonnie Prince Charlie. One of the world's great romantic legends was about to begin. What happened, we shall see in part 3, as we follow the story of Scotland into a new era, an era that was to see it develop into a modern European nation that would help build an empire.